Our next guest grew up in Iran, moved to Concord, Massachusetts, and ended up in a leading role at the World Bank and then at the helm of a multi-billion-dollar investment firm. Find out her early insights on the energy business in emerging markets and how to pivot to follow where the puck is moving to. I'm Aoife Devitt, and welcome to the 50 Faces podcast, a podcast committed to revealing the richness and diversity of the world of investment by focusing on its people and their stories. I'm joined today by Afsaneh Beschloss, who is the founder and CEO of RockCreek, an investment firm which invests across diverse sectors with a special focus on climate, affordable housing, and education investments in developed, emerging, and frontier markets. She's on the board of directors of the World Resources Institute, the Council on Foreign Relations, and the Rockefeller Foundation, and holds numerous other board and trustee roles. Welcome, Afsaneh. Thanks for joining me today.
It's wonderful to be with you, Aoife, and thank you for inviting me.
Well, let's start with your background and career trajectory. And I know this may take a little bit longer than for most. It's been quite an extensive one. Where did you grow up? What did you study? And how did you come to enter the world of investing ultimately?
So I was born in Iran, and, since people have probably been seeing various demonstrations and almost a revolution by women, it has been sort of in the news in recent times. When I grew up there, women had all kinds of jobs. There were ministers, they were in the government, they taught. And even today, believe it or not, largest number of STEM engineers happens to be in Iran. And one woman who got the Fields Medal in math was born there, came here, of course, to Stanford and Princeton and a number of other places. But the reason I mention that is that in terms of women, what we could see is that even growing up in a society that was very different then and certainly very different today, it's possible to do a lot. And I happened to have come to the United States as an exchange student when I was 16 and went to Concord, Massachusetts, and happened to live across from Bob Solow. Now, at the time, I have to tell you, I was not intending to study economics. I had no idea that Bob Solow was a Nobel Prize winner economist, but no question that, you see people and you learn what they're doing in sort of consciously or unconsciously, it probably rubs off a little bit here or there. And then I went on to study economics at university in England. So that was sort of the start of the career trajectory. And if I could just go on, it was interesting. When I was at Oxford, I was studying economics. And when I was doing my postgraduate work there, one of my professors started something called the Oxford Energy Institute, and he asked me to be his student assistant. And there were a lot of oil and gas people who used to come to this conference, including CEOs of the biggest companies and policymakers involved in the energy sector. So it was a really interesting place to be for a young student, and certainly influenced me. And one of the things he said, and you'll laugh at this probably, is, you're a girl and all the boys do oil. You should do something that's a little different, differentiate yourself. And why don't you learn about a cleaner fuel? Why don't you look at natural gas? And so I ended up studying a little bit about the economics of natural gas. Fast forward, I went to JP Morgan. I did their training program and then got to do some work in the M&A related and corporate finance group on energy. And then when I went to the Young World Bank, because I was, as you said, very interested in economic development and had studied it and taught it. Also, when I was at Oxford, I was recruited by the Young Professional Program and then went to their bank's energy department. So that was sort of the beginning of my career, if you want to say. But it's sort of interesting how these little coincidences in life can have a big impact.
Absolutely. Well, actually, funny you mentioned Bob Solow, because I sit on a board of the MDRC and I had just come off that board as I was going on. I certainly wasn't filling those shoes, but still certainly a legend well into his retirement years, if you call it that. We're going to definitely talk more about the energy immersion that you had there because of some of the work you do at RockCreek now. But before that, I'd love to talk about your 20 years you spent at the World Bank, because clearly time of tremendous change, I'm sure, while you were there. And what would you say your key takeaways professionally and developmentally were from the 20 years you spent there?
I think really one or two lessons. One is that when you learn about economic development, one is how you have to sort of empower countries that you're working on to do what is best for them, because each country is different. and their needs are different. Their education needs, health needs, housing and energy related and other things is very much related to their local needs. So it's very important to understand the differentiation between countries and cultures. So that is important. At the same time, what was really interesting is we learned a lot as we worked across countries. And how do you then take advantage of the knowledge gained in one place, whether it is in new climate tech investments or in whatever area, to take advantage of that in other countries? And I think that was a very big role that the bank played when I was there. And you could really do the knowledge sharing among countries and among people and use the best academics, use the best practitioners, use the best people who implemented projects in different areas, whether it was infrastructure or it was education or health or whatever it was, to get to do the interesting things. The second thing often was that financing, which is what you and I have been involved in for a long time, both of us, is very important. And we always think that the reason things don't happen is lack of finance. And what I learned also, one of the first studies I did of the health sector in Senegal was that there was in fact financing, but it was not well organized. And there was different sources of finance that conflicted with each other. It was not well coordinated. And so a lot of it got wasted. And it did not also go to the priority areas, which would have been in that case, primary care and preventive health. And it went into areas that were not high priority. So very interestingly, when I look at things today, I see that some of those lessons are incredibly relevant today. And while financing is incredibly important, it's not getting the financing, but it's having that know-how to strategically prioritize. And then you can sort of go back and see which countries succeeded and which countries did not succeed. I should also mention my career at the bank showed me that you can, as a young person, do anything if you put your mind to it. And I had sort of, if you could separate it, two different careers. One was, as you said, in energy and clean energy. We were very early, and we'll talk about that in a little while. But I also sort of had the opportunity to work on the financial side of the World Bank and really went from the bottom to the top. As you know, I went on the trading floor, learned fixed income trading, and built on the corporate finance work I had done earlier at JP Morgan, and then eventually became treasurer of the World Bank and his chief investment officer. So it was an incredible journey.
And in particular, I'd love to ask about emerging markets, because that's somewhere I've spent some time in my own career. And I know at RockCreek, you've had a high conviction in that area. Do you think you sort of saw more nuance in emerging markets through your time at the World Bank? Maybe saw the ability to see through the Western media sound bites?
You are so right, Evan, because what is interesting is generally emerging markets or specific countries in emerging markets are seen either as like, wow, like when China was growing hugely, or now India is growing hugely, or Vietnam or ASEAN countries are hugely, or like basket cases that are. And I think neither story I learned is true. And it's just like any developed country as well. We saw what happened in the UK, which you know very well, and where you lived for a little while. And that's only just a couple of months ago. So I think any country can not have good, proper policies. But the things that I learned in emerging markets is that you really need to sort of take your own fate in your own hands. You need to use the development institutions. You need to use all the aid that is out there. You need to use the capital markets productively, but you have to use them very carefully, and also be very careful on debt that you put on your balance sheet, because unlike the US or other major economies that can borrow, and we see sometimes borrow more than we should, if you're an emerging market, it's a very different situation. If you borrow and you can't pay back your loans, there is a major problem in terms of borrowing anymore for your growth. And I saw a lot of lessons of countries that did it right, and a lot of situations where countries that did not do it right. And as we sit here today, 65 countries have or are about to default on their loans. So that's kind of a very significant number.
Very interesting lessons there. And can you talk us through then what led you to found RockCreek and what your vision was for that firm then and also then now?
So when we started RockCreek in 2003 or 4, the idea was that we would basically be an investment firm that really partnered with investors. And since I had been, most of my career had been on the other side, i.e. being at the World Bank, on the treasury side of the World Bank, we tried to make money. And we actually did a lot of knowledge sharing with our so-called clients and countries that work with us to share a lot of what we had learned with them to see how they could set up the correct benchmarks, how you monitored your performance, how you got into new areas to maximize return, whether you were a central bank or a pension fund, or we even started working with the Norwegian oil fund when they were just launched in 2001, 2002, believe it or not. So what I realized when I was on that side was that most of the financial firms that were coming to us were selling products and selling something. And they did not always partner with us. They didn't understand what our needs were. And so the idea of RockCreek was how could we create a firm that really partnered with pension funds, with endowments, with foundations, but also help them generate returns in a more sustainable way. So meet your return objectives, but do that in a way that is sustainable. And I have to tell you, Afin, things have changed a lot from when we started to today.
I presume the partnership notion hasn't changed, but I'd love to hear how your focus, and you seem to have been very adaptive at migrating into areas where, because they're seeing where the puck is going, so to speak, or
Yes.
seeing where you can add value.
Absolutely. So as you said, I think the partnership concept has been very important. But as you said, when we started RockCreek, I think there were a few investors who were interested truly in that sustainability topic. But I would say the majority of investors were watching that. And the assumption was that there was a conflict between the two objectives of return and sustainability. And I think the big change over the last 10 years, and then I would say in a much faster way, since you started your podcast in the last few years, has been this sort of move towards sustainability actually can generate returns that are also not correlated with other returns, but completely with other investments. And so that it can be fully integrated in your total investment. And I think that has been the most exciting part of my work and journey. And like I said, since we had started doing this kind of investing at the World Bank, it was kind of in my DNA, but the DNA also of my partners here. And what is really, really exciting now is working with others who are working with us or have selected to work with us. And really, some are interested in, I would say generally most people are interested in climate related and clean energy related investments. And then some would be more interested in job creation or care for the elderly, housing for the elderly, and affordable housing plus health and education. And again, you know better than anybody else that some of those, when you look at the putting together technology and digital health or looking at technology and education, this period of COVID has made those areas much more interesting and important in everyone's life. And while in person is equally important, these investments have generated very strong returns.
Of course, and it drives value in the healthcare area where we all need it to save money and drive costs down. And I'd love to return to the topic of energy, because clearly, yes, even in the last, say, year, we've started talking about energy security, energy terrorism. Clearly, the availability of energy is a concern, as well as the sustainability, which hasn't gone away, that concern. You could say you've almost been an insider in that industry, maybe at early stages of your career, having worked closely in the natural gas business. How has that informed how you think about climate-oriented investments today?
I think one thing, and again, you've been an investor yourself for many years, the one thing that we learned since the Ukraine war is you cannot put all your eggs in one basket, right? And COVID, of course, showed us that you don't want to, as a supply chain matter, you don't want to put all your eggs in one basket either. Whether that's the source of supply, whether that is really anything that you produce or you consume that comes from a place where you do not have control. So I think with energy also, two or three things. One is that what I learned is that there was a lot of countries that had local natural gas that they could replace imported coal from. But when they would get, for example, coal power plants coming into their countries and sold to them in a subsidized form by some countries, it led them to choose coal over their own local natural gas. And then the same thing I have been seeing today as we sit here together and talk in solar and wind. Because again, particularly in emerging markets, you're seeing a lot of solar, instead of solar and wind, which would be natural for many countries that have incredible appropriate climates for either or both, are continuing to use heavy oils or they're using coal because, again, they don't have either the funds to invest or they're being sold plants coal power plants. And the very big conversation is going on in South Africa and Indonesia, as you may know, on sort of moving away from coal into cleaner energies. And I think what Ukraine war has shown us is even in the US and Europe, where there has been a lot of talk about telling the developing countries, emerging markets, not to use coal, there's been backtracking because there was a need for energy. If we look at the positive right now, is that what has happened in Ukraine has led people to realize that energy that is sustainable, meaning solar and wind, is something that is key to their future. And it will take a while to build out the right plans. And we know the issues right now about supply chains in terms of if you don't want to also have all your solar panels come from one country, you need more suppliers than one country. You need multiple countries to produce solar panels. Those are all things that we're going to in terms of operationally. But if you and I probably were having this conversation in, 4 or 5 years, I would say renewable energy will be much, much more common in homes, in commercial areas, in manufacturing. In fact, as we speak today, we're working with one of our clients on aviation fuel, alternatives to current aviation fuel. So when you look at that, you see all the options that are existing. And I think I'm just very excited about the potential.
Well, I'd like to move now to talk about another aspect of the ESG moniker, which is around some of the social and diversity elements. And I'd love to ask you about your experience as a founder, because I think you really do set the standard in terms of how to approach fundraising as a minority-owned firm, but yet not wishing to have that label confine you in any way or restrict you from the kind of allocations that you deserve. Can you talk us through your experience as a founder, maybe the early days and lessons you learned along that way?
Sure. And I think you and I met quite a few years ago, and you've always been very kind and given me excellent advice. So always grateful for that. And I think both at RockCreek but other firms, the one thing that we wanted to always do is really find out what is the most innovative way to add value, right, to a portfolio. And that has been sort of the line that you could draw from the founding to today. The fact that we happen to have diverse ownership, diverse management, diversity in our intern group, diversity in our board, across every aspect that you could measure, I have realized I didn't appreciate quite in the beginning, but I appreciate now that it is still not very common. And for us, it's happened naturally. Again, maybe because I grew up in a different country. I'm an immigrant. I have always had to make the extra effort as a woman, as many of us have. It sort of was not unusual that, if we started a firm, it would not be the easiest thing if you happen to be diverse. And I have to tell you, that today, when we're 15 billion, I wouldn't say it's easier than when we started out. I think it's still equally hard. There's still a lot of lip service to both what you said, sustainability and diversity. But then there are more and more people every day that see the benefits. And we have been spending a lot of time and resources and funding on technology and data, looking at, for example, we've invested 2.7 billion since we started, 2.8 now, actually, billion in women-owned firms and companies. And that has only been bottoms up, looking at the highest return firms or companies. So it hasn't been like, let's go look for women-owned businesses. We just have big databases. We look through, if we're looking at some, climate investments, what are the best companies? And then if you impose a few more factors, you can see among the best who happens to have also a more gender balance. Or if you're looking at other areas, we're looking at other elements of sustainability and ESG. So what you see is that all of these, you need to continuously make effort. But I think I'm particularly excited about the data effort, because the data will prove for itself what is good, what is bad, and what works and what doesn't work. So I hope to be able to share that data with a larger group of people to just show that both diversity and sustainability can add value.
That sounds fascinating. And I think in keeping with a trend I've seen happen in the private or the alternative sector, increasingly that was seen as being a little bit more qualitative or subjective in the past. And now to bring this data validation, I suppose, and the quantification of some of the stats is really fascinating. And tied to that, so you mentioned your experience as a founder. How would you say the industry has changed? I mean, you may be the exception in your firm with the diversity at every level. Would you say that the industry is changing at a pace that you think is appropriate? Would you like to see more change?
So, what I'm seeing is, for example, in the venture area, you see more women and more diversity in general. One reason for that is because you don't have to start with a $2 billion fund. You can start with 50 million or 100 million or 200 million and be successful and prove yourself. So where industry, I think, is changing is in venture, which was both in terms of venture funds and venture funding. You see more diversity on both. However, we have gathered a lot of data in that area. And what you're not seeing is women often get funded at the seed level. But then when they go into sort of growth stage, they can be excellent companies, but it becomes, again, hard because there are not many firms that are looking at them. There's still, I think it's unconscious bias, not conscious bias, but there is still issues when you go to the next stage. You don't see too many women in private equity or women-founded private equity, which is interesting. And within private equity firms, I think, the 12th partner at Carlyle and had a very good experience there. But you don't see too many women even today in most of the larger private equity firms. So that, I think, they're bringing in new blood, they're bringing in young people. But when you see mid-level and higher level investment individuals, you're not seeing too many women or people of color. So I think it's an area where things are changing. They're changing for the better, but a lot more work is needed.
And another area, of course, where more diversity is needed is on boards and in chair and other executive roles. And you hold a number of those roles. I always like to ask this question when someone has a large portfolio like you do. What do you think you bring to these roles, and what do you think makes a good director or chair when you work in that role?
So I think first I recommend to everyone to do board roles, both for profit and not for profit, especially. I think it's a great way to both give back, but also to contribute, but also to learn. And so I think if you do anything, you have to do it really well. So if you're taking on a board role, you should take it very seriously. But you see things happening in real life that you may not see otherwise. And I think you have to bring something to the table. And I think investment people, because we're seeing so much across so many sectors, across so many companies, we're seeing a lot that is very valuable to the single company or single nonprofit that we are involved with. That's number one. Number two, I think you want to bring in, someone may bring in technology skills, someone may bring finance and investments audit, someone may bring in legal or governance, but you have to have some value add depending on what your own area of expertise is. But then in terms of your learning, you sit with other people who are unbelievably smart in a variety of ways. And just by sitting in a room with 10 or 20 people who are very accomplished in different ways, you just learn so much. And then, you're hopefully contributing to the mission of the company or the nonprofit, but you also are learning yourself every day. And you bring that back to your own company, or you bring that learning back to whatever you're doing otherwise.
And in terms of the chair role, I'm sure you've witnessed many chairs, you've been a chair. What do you think is the key to effective chairing?
I think what I've learned about being an effective chair is listening really well, because it's easy to nod, but I think the best advice that I was given and that I would give is really listen carefully and get everyone's views. Because as you get people to provide their views, you'll see that there's more commonality than there might be different views on a specific topic, but more commonality on an approach. And you get to a solution if you are thinking of it in that way. And so I think the best job of a chair is really getting everyone's views in a collaborative way. And then, of course, making a decision. Following up is really important too, because sometimes decisions get made, but boards only meet, 4 times or whatever number of times a year. It's that follow-up. What kind of follow-up mechanism do you put in place so that whatever decision has been made is implemented, monitored, and you find out if you were, it was successful or you need to make changes. So that other part of it is equally important.
That's a really good point. Follow up and examination of decision-making efficacy, I suppose, as well.
Exactly.
So many of the boards, the roles you have, I don't even list them all, might be tied to a certain movement or mission. Is there any of those entities or causes that are particularly close to your heart?
Again, I think a number of them are related to, for example, climate, which is something I care about, climate and energy and education. Those would be sort of the commonality. If you looked across the foundations or the nonprofits or that I work across, they really sort of cut those areas. So I would say those education and clean energy and climate definitely cut across the board, plus health.
But I'd like to go back to some personal reflections now. With a storied career like yours, I'm sure there are some highs and lows. Are there any that you can mention, and maybe any lessons that you took from the low points?
On the low points, I think it was interesting. I was in one of my earlier jobs, and I had one boss who had left, who had been unbelievably supportive, unbelievably helping me to get better and to learn from all the things we need to learn from. And I got somebody who was really, both in terms of mentoring, in terms of opportunities, in terms of appreciating the team, including myself, was not very positive force. And I think what I learned is not whether I'm good or I'm not good, but I think how negative energy is not something that helps you propel. So that style of management was not making me a better version of myself. It was holding me back. And it took me a while because, I had been used to working with somebody who was the opposite, but I realized that I had to take myself out of that situation. And sometimes we keep ourselves in a situation that is not productive and one that is not making us happy. And it so happens that either I was fortunate, something else came up and I moved out of that. But I worry that maybe if I had not been careful, I might have been in that situation too long. And then I've seen with other friends and colleagues that it has impacted them in the long run. So one piece of advice that I got early on from one of my mentors was make sure the people you work with, you respect, you're learning from, and you like. And that like was also important. And I think when she said that at the time, I didn't quite appreciate it. Today, I hugely appreciate and never forget those 3 words. So
it's really interesting. Roxanne Martino, who was a guest way back in 2020 when we started this, gave very similar advice about, in her case, toxic work situations. She said about taking yourself out of them, not waiting, taking yourself out. And I think you can only do that if you've had a proactive approach to your career, though. So I think you have to bear that in mind, that unfortunately other people may not take you out for you. You have to make that decision. You can't get away without telling me some high points, because I'm sure you've had the people you've mixed with, the places, the positions you hold now, there must have been some high points in there.
No, I think a lot of high points. The one thing I think I found, and maybe again, that goes back to sort of having had these changes starting when I was very young, and then having moved around the world, having lived in different places, having worked in different places. I think the high points were really when, honestly, I found mission and work become one. And I just feel very fortunate because whether it was the World Bank, whether it is RockCreek, it is very much the case. And I work, honestly, every day with people that I'm learning something from and who are pushing me and my colleagues and everyone I work with to be even more innovative and to think of things that we have not thought about before. I think that is a high point for me. Maybe that sounds a little crazy, but thinking about what's the next thing. And I was just thinking that we happen to be invested in OpenAI, but the way it happened at the time, 5-6 years ago, we thought probably that money is gone out the door and never come back. And when you see the last few weeks, it might be sort of the best idea. We'll still, the jury is still out, but it could be very interesting and life-changing, hopefully in positive ways versus negative ways. But it goes back to say high points are, you can only look at them after the fact, sort of. And I'm married to a historian, so he says you have to wait. He writes about presidents until they're dead and their papers come out. But in the high points, looking back, you have to kind of look back and see the things that were really important in terms of turning points in your life, but made you a better person and allowed you to do more interesting things, but things that can make a difference in the world.
And that's why I love doing this podcast form, because it forces the guests, but also myself, to kind of reflect. And sometimes we don't always take the time to do that naturally. So we started talking about very illustrious economist, Bob Solow. Were there other key people in your life who influenced you, and in what way?
So I was very fortunate, and by coincidence, they happened to be women. It was not that I didn't realize that I sought that out, but maybe it was a coincidence. Maybe it was my unconscious bias. But Deanne Julius was one of the people I worked with early in my career. And Deanne had a family when she was quite young. She moved to London, and she was one of my first bosses. And She's one of the people I mentioned, gave me a great opportunity to learn and start something from scratch, which was investing more in cleaner fuels early on. And she had faith in me, but she also kind of mentored me. And then she went on to London and she continued to do really interesting things herself. She was very innovative. She became the first woman chief economist at Shell and British Airways. All the pension plan of British Airways reported into her, and at the time did incredibly well. She has been on the board of Temasek. She has been on the board of Roche, chaired the board of UCL, University College London, and many other. Chatham House, was a founding member of the Monetary Policy Committee of the Bank of England. And the reason I say that is, as she was doing these things, we always would talk, and I would tell her whatever I was doing, and she would give me, some of it was day-to-day advice, some of it was more strategic advice, but just watching her career and just seeing that there's not like one pigeonhole that you are stuck with was really, really important. And then another one of my mentors was Jessica Einhorn, who I also worked with at the World Bank. And Jessica was most recently on the board of BlackRock. She was dean at SAIS, but she's a great finance person. And she always said, think about life and work balance too. Not that she did that herself, not that she balanced. She was always very dedicated, very hard work, all work person. But she always reminded me how important family is in your happiness. And a lot of other good advice that she's given me through the years and continues to today. So again, a number of the people who've been very important in my life continue, have been there for a long time, and they've been very generous with lifelong advice.
But two women who seem to be personification of the idea that there is no limit to what you can take on and what you can do. It's a very, very inspiring. Did those women or any other key people give you any words of wisdom that you live by, or any creed or motto that you want to share now?
It was never sort of a specific motto. It really was, at the end of it, what they said is, do what makes you happy. And don't feel you have to do something where you think somebody else is expecting you to, or, you're trying to, whatever. The most important thing is, if what you're doing makes you happy and fulfills you, that is the most important measure versus an external measure. So now this doesn't mean that their mentoring implied that the way the world values you is also not important, but make sure you have the right values, but also think about your fulfillment and happiness as something which is important. We only have one life. So.
Well, that is a wonderful reminder. And my last question is around any advice you would have for your younger self, for that young student coming from Iran to Concord, Massachusetts. Is there anything you know now that maybe you wish you could tell that young woman?
So the one thing that, and I don't know to what extent other people you've talked to and yourself have experienced this, and I assume many of us have, is that as women, we always felt, and we needed to really work 3 times harder, do a lot more. And now when I look back, particularly at sort of the years when I was working hard, when I had children in their early years, I was still continuing to travel like crazy. And when I look back, I mean, honestly, if I had done a third of what I was doing in terms of both travel and working 24/7, I would have probably been equally effective, if not more effective. And I would have spent more time with my family. So it's the things that you miss that you sort of realize. And again, I spent a lot of time with the kids, but not as much as I would have, like in today, if you ask me, would have liked to. And I always felt like there was this next thing at work. And I think, honestly, if I had done a fraction, it would have been equally effective and productive.
I suppose the issue is we don't know. Back then, we don't know what's working. We're throwing stuff at the wall, don't know what's sticking. So I understand that very much. Well, Afsaneh, I don't use this word very often. I don't throw it around, but you are, and always have been to me, a legend in this field. Not only because of what you've done, but what you continue to do. Continuously innovating, looking around the corner, looking at what the next phase of investing will hold. And I look to you for inspiration. So thank you so much for coming here and for sharing your insights with us.
Honored to be included, and so wonderful to talk to you today.
I'm Aoife Devitt. Thank you for listening to the 50 Faces podcast. If you liked what you heard and would like to tune in to hear more inspiring investors and their personal journeys, please subscribe on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be construed as investment advice, and all views are personal and should not be attributed to the organisations and affiliations of the host or any guest.